Hey everybody, welcome back again to the Words of Life Daily Bible Reading and Podcast. This is the episode of our weekly recap with Kevin and myself, where we will go back through everything we read this last week and kind of synopsisize it. Is that even a word?
Sure, I don't know. And everything may be a little bit ambitious. I don't know that we usually get through everything.
Okay,
but,
sure. Super ambitious. We're going to do our best to at least summarize the things that we've
There we
read.
go. And talk about what we think is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and just have a general good discussion. Before we do that, though, we always like to catch up a little bit and say, hello, Kevin. What's going on?
Adam. Not too much. How you doing out there? We had our first 100-degree days last week, so
Fun.
welcome to summer in April here in Arizona. So yeah.
We're in the period of yo-yo weather.
Yeah, I heard. My mom was telling me about that. The hail one day and the
So
sun the next.
seriously, it was crazy. So we've had lots of random thunderstorms, and yeah, the skies just open up, and I've you hear about like big hail,
Yeah.
but they were like the size of grapes.
Okay. Yeah,
It was
good size.
pretty good size,
Yeah.
but it lasted for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then it was gone. You
Yeah.
know, but yeah, that was fun, and but we've had like 79 degrees followed by 34 degrees, and we're got this back and forth. So
We're going to get a little of that because, like I said, it was 100 last week. It's like 90-something today, but it's supposed to be 70 by Saturday, and then 81
Right.
the next day, and
Yeah.
it's all over. But, yeah, it should be pleasant, at least for our Easter weekend, right, coming up here. Not too bad
that'll
weather
be,
here. So
that'll be great. I got to preach this last Sunday down in
Yeah, you're
Athens,
saying.
which was fun. That was the start of Passover,
Yes.
which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it was been Palm Sunday there, right? Yep.
Yep. And then I don't know if does it always coincide with Palm Sunday?
I mean, it should, right, because it's the last
Right.
week, right? And so if you sort of look at our Jesus account from the Gospels, right, he enters in, he's there for a week, and the Passover then is the following. So
The following, yeah.
yeah, we call Palm Sunday typically. I mean, look, the Catholics celebrate it as sort of a holiday thing, right?
Yeah.
Palm Sunday, but that's the triumphal entry, right?
Yeah,
the beginning.
that's the beginning of the
Passover
week.
there.
Jesus spends
Yep.
a week there. He's put on the cross at the end of the week and resurrected on Sunday. So
Yep. So yeah,
So Easter, we've as a country,
yeah,
it followed the Catholic Christian holiday of Easter that is supposed to is designed by a lot of people to set aside to thinking about and being thankful for the resurrection of the Lord. So
yeah, and that's one that's an interesting holiday as we get on a good side tangent before we get too far into our conversation here, right? But I mean, it's one of the few days that we actually know when it should have been and what it was. Remember,
Yeah.
following the Jewish Passover schedule, right? And so, with as much confidence as you can of any sort of thing, I suppose you could say, yeah, this is the day on which Jesus was resurrected. And then we turned it into the ancient medieval Catholic Church turned it into a pagan holiday of Easter and roll them together and turn it into something, and then there's good bunnies and all kinds of stuff that
who knows where the bunny came from, but
you commercialize
whatever.
it and stuff, right? But yeah, you took a pagan spring festival and a resurrection thing, throw them together like they did with a lot of stuff. Just to
crazy. But it is a good thing to set aside and be thankful for. So I can definitely appreciate that. But when you think about things like that, not to get too far off this rabbit hole, but it's wonderful that the world recognizes these things. I think it's fantastic, and it's a reminder because we were going through the book of Acts and we just went through all the Gospels where we read these accounts and these events that were happening, and the Jews would gather together to remember the Passover, which was going all the way back to when God let them out of Egypt, right? And so all of these things lining up through history, and that God lined up Jesus's death and resurrection to coincide with that same event.
Yeah.
And then 50 days after, which was day of Pentecost. Right? So when is that happening? So if we say April 15th, so
Let's do the math from here, right?
Right,
That's
yeah.
going to be,
like June, right?
April, so all of May, in the middle of June, yeah.
Yeah, so-
maybe early July, because Easter's so late this year. But yeah, either way, yeah.
Right. So in 50 days after this Sunday,
This Sunday, right.
we can celebrate Acts 2, right?
That's right.
The beginning of the church. That's very cool. So this last week, to get into our recap, we read Acts chapters 17 through 25. And so, just as a kind of a general recap, the book of Acts starts with the fulfillment and reminder of what Jesus promised, which was, when I'm gone, I'm going to send you the Helper, the Holy Spirit. And then we have the 12th spot of the apostle, Matthias being chosen as the apostle. And then we have Acts chapter 2 starting, where the Spirit descends upon the 12 apostles, and this massive roaring sound causes everybody in town to come see what's going on, and he preaches this amazing sermon. But he's fulfilling, they begin that day, fulfilling all the things that Jesus had talked about. And he had commissioned them, you're going to be my witnesses, he says, to Judea, Samaria, and then all the world. And so we go on from Acts chapter 2, where we have thousands of people coming to Jesus and being baptized and being added to the church. And we see a lot of the things that they were dealing with, where they were house to house, and a lot of people, because they had come from all over the world and didn't go home when they had planned to go home, the church gathered together and rallied together, and they were all sharing things together and making sure everybody was good. We see the church having some struggles, with the Grecian widows not being served properly, and so they established 7 men to take care of that. And then that one of those men was Stephen. And when Stephen rises up and he starts preaching the word, he gathers some really big opposition, and they end up murdering him. When Saul of Tarsus was witness and approving of that. But little did Saul know that Jesus had a plan for him, right? So we see Saul, and then we have Peter and Philip taking a big part in some of those chapters after 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we have another recap of Saul, right? And Saul is converted very powerfully by Jesus himself.
Yes, dramatically, yes. He appears to him, right?
Yeah, on the road to Damascus. And Jesus sends a vision to a man named Ananias, who is sent to basically teach Paul all the things he needs to do, including that he needs to be baptized. Paul immediately is baptized after Ananias meets with him, and then begins his rapid transformation into becoming one of the greatest preachers and evangelists that the world and the church needed. So, I think that was a brief enough
takes us up to where we are here a little bit.
Right.
I mean, he then goes on and starts doing these journeys, right, which we saw last time. And so we're getting in the second time now, right? As we pick up our reading this week, remember at the end of last time, they were starting the second one where he and Barnabas decided to go separate ways. And so Paul took Silas and is going back through those churches that he had established the first time on his first journey through the, Macedonia type area there, Turkey area. Anyway.
Cyprus, Antioch, Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe is what I have listed down here.
Those are in basically modern day Turkey now, and so he's going back through those places and will go further, right? He will go further on this time as well, which we got into, I think, sort of this. We got into Philippi. So we're into this further region at this point, where we kind of left him off last time. After the Philippian jailer account in Acts 16. And so as we pick up, then this time we find him in Thessalonica, or I was reading this time, you can, in a lot of these apps, you can hear the audio depending on the version. And whichever one I was listening to this time.
Thessalonica,
which is probably more accurate than the way we say it, Thessalonica. It's probably Thessalonica.
Right.
But, however you say it, that's where we find Paul sort of starting off here, is Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, which, if you've read Acts before, these should be some pretty familiar stories to you. Some pretty familiar stories as you kind of go through it, especially, the things in Berea, right? Everyone knows what about the Bereans. They're more noble.
They're more noble. Why are they more noble, Kevin?
Because they search the scriptures daily to see if the things that Paul is talking about are true, right?
Yeah.
And so, for us, as we think about that, and this is an important idea, and we, there used to be Berean Bible bookstores. I don't know if they still are anymore. I think almost all the bookstores have gone defunct with the age of online shipping. But, we think about the scriptures as being the New Testament and the things that are written. But, in this case, what he's actually talking about is the Old Testament scriptures, right? Paul is telling them things about who Jesus is. And what they're doing is they're going back and they're checking their Old Testament scriptures, and they're seeing that, oh, yes, this Jesus is the promised Messiah, right? And so as he teaches, Paul's methodology of teaching, it's pretty clear, is he teaches them from the Old Testament prophets. And he teaches them from even Genesis and the plan that God has laid out, right, in this sort of redemption story. And so when they're searching the scriptures, they're searching to see if these things are so, right? Is that really what God said back there? Is that really what the prophet said? What's going on, right? But we make application, certainly, that if people come to you and say, hey, here's this thing that Jesus says you should do, or here's the thing God wants you to do in your life, we should go search and see, check our Old Testaments and our New Testaments now, right? And see, is that the truth, right? Is that what we should be doing there?
Yeah, 100%. So when you're talking about that, I couldn't help but remember our study through the book of Hebrews a while back, and in Hebrews chapter 5, remember when the author of Hebrews got to the point where he wanted to talk to them more about Melchizedek.
Right, but you don't know enough.
He's like, I'd really like to say more, but you guys
right.
at this point should have been teachers.
Right.
But you need to be reminded of the basic things.
Yeah.
And at the end of chapter 5 of Hebrews, it says, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good and evil, good from evil. And so, when we talk about the Bereans, they demonstrated
They're doing that.
That principle right there. They were constantly practicing and refining their knowledge and their discernment of good and evil.
Yeah.
Which is great. Which is inspiration for us. We should be able to do the same thing.
Yeah. Another thing we get there in 17, which is pretty important to us as well, is this sermon to the Athenians, right? The sermon on Mars.
Oh yeah, I love that.
It's a good sermon, right? And it's it's a useful, almost like counterpoint to Paul's preaching style, right? Because usually he's preaching, like we said, from the Hebrew Scriptures, right? This time he approaches a group of people. He doesn't go into the synagogue, right? He's going straight to where there isn't one here in Athens. These people are wholly devoted to religious things. They're very devout, right? They got gods and idols and temples and statues to everything, right? Just in case. But he takes a different approach here, right? Let me tell you about this God who you want to be serving, who you're trying to serve, that you don't know at all, right? He's the God of the Hebrews, right? This is who he is. I'm not going to go back to the Hebrew Scriptures and sort of point this out to you. Instead, I'm going to take a different approach. Now, he's still doing the same thing. Right, he's still going on and he's teaching them, but he's using a different entry point, right? He's meeting them where they are, and he's using some other sort of way. I'm touching on your devoutness and your desire to know godly things, and instead of saying, hey, we're looking for a Messiah, let me tell you I found him, he's going to start at a totally different point, right? And he's going to get around to, hey, we're all children of God, right? And God is at different times let you, overlooked the things you didn't know because you were children. But now he's picked a person, and here he is, right? And let me tell you about the resurrection of the dead, which they're like, what? I want to hear more about that. That's interesting, right? Tell us more about this resurrection of the dead, right? And so he takes a different approach, and he gets similar results, right? He still gets people who are interested in godly things to listen to what he has to say. And, there are those that says some became followers of Paul and believed, and he lists some people off, right?
Yep, for sure.
A number of others that were there.
So one of the things that we're going to get there fairly soon is the book of 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
What's really interesting when we read through Acts, we see Paul visiting all these places.
That he'll later write to, yeah.
That he's later going to write these letters to these places, and in those letters, he has a lot to share.
Yeah.
But I really like what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses like 19 and following. He says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. So his goal is always to win people to Jesus. Then he says in verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, which referring back to Jews still following Judaism. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak, and so on and so forth. To the Greeks I become a Greek, that sort of a thing, right? And so my point in bringing that up is that Paul, in this sermon to Athens, he realized the best approach was to just meet them where they're at.
Right, he became Greek. Right,
to them. Greek to them, right? And so that's a lesson for us because we're going to have these interactions with people all the time. And we need to be able to not just have a one-size-fits-all message. Now, the message itself, the core of the message is not going to change.
Right.
But how we deliver that message and how we approach people is really important. And so when you have people with zero knowledge of the Bible, you can't just hit them with like prophecies of Daniel and Revelation.
Right. They don't care. They don't know what any of that
That doesn't mean anything to them.
Right.
And it's probably just going to confuse them and turn them off. Right, but you can start with stories of people like them that have come to the Lord, and and be relatable.
Well, and you can certainly see, like we said at the very beginning of Hebrews, right, and in other places we'll see that you can start with the things that you see around you, right?
Yeah.
Proclaim that there is a God, right? And now,
Yep.
like, where did these things come from? How did these things get here, right? That you can start in those sorts of places, and we'll see, like you mentioned here later in our reading, towards the end of our reading, when he gets down to Jerusalem, he's going to do a number of things that are Jewish, right? He's going to shave his head because he had this vow. He's going to take these other people at a vow, and he's going to do these things and go into the temple with them, and he's going to make sure he doesn't take Gentiles with him into the temple as to not to offend them unnecessarily, right? And as you look at those things, there's something we have to remember, right? Which is he became all things to all people in order to spread the gospel. But we'll also see, the Hebrew author told us, and in other places we'll see as well, that he doesn't ever do things to avoid persecution. Right? He doesn't change things to get out of his own suffering because he doesn't want to suffer, right? He only does things so that he can win more souls.
Right.
If his motive is, if I do this, they won't persecute me, then he doesn't do it, right? He's willing to suffer whatever, right? But if he knows he can win more converts and get an open door into somebody's heart by, whatever, then he's going to do that as well. And that's an important thing for us to understand too. We don't just want to go along and not be seen. We only fit in so much as it helps facilitate the spread of the gospel without changing the message or avoid suffering.
Yep, absolutely. So we see there Paul in Thessalonica,
yes,
Berea, and Athens, and then in 18 we see him in Corinth.
Yeah, which he's there for a long time.
He is,
right?
like 18 months.
Yeah, which is one of the few time markers we get, right? There's a couple of time indicators we've mentioned.
Yep.
We saw before, the death of Herod. Okay, that's something we can look in the historical record, kind of get a fix on, right? Okay, he's in Corinth. He's there for a year and a half. Okay, that at least tells us a little bit of when we are sort of timeline. So when we see those things in Acts, they're kind of important little notes whenever you go and look. Like if you try and look up, like you were talking about, a timeline and looking and seeing, how long does this thing take? They're getting those informations from, extrapolating travel times in those days, and also these time markers that Luke is dropping for us along the way.
Yep. So just for that, for the sake of that conversation, so that we have kind of a basic timeline, from what I've been able to glean from people smarter than I who've done the work.
Done the math.
Right. The first missionary journey kind of starts in Acts 13 through 14. That's probably AD 46 through 48. So a couple of years there. Acts 15, 36 through 2 is what we call the second missionary journey. It's AD 49 through 52. So about three years or so.
Yeah. With a year and a half of it hanging out in one place here in Corinth.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Yep. Now, third missionary journey starts in the middle of chapter 18 and goes through chapter 21, 17. And that is about a 4-year period, and that's the third missionary journey from AD 53 to 57.
Yeah.
And then we have arrest and imprisonment, which we also read about this week. And there's at least a couple of years where he's arrested and just sitting there in Caesarea.
Yeah.
Waiting for the Jews to figure out what they're going to do. And then, of course, we had a changing of the guards and who was ruling at that time, Festus and all that kind of stuff. So Felix and Festus. So that's basically the timeline. So the missionary journeys is approximately 8 to 9 years of time. And we cover it in rapid...
Yeah, in just a couple of... Right?
In a few chapters, right?
Yeah.
But so it's helpful to know that it was 8 or 9 years of Paul's life dedicated to traveling around and preaching the word as much as he can. So
yeah, and that's 8 or 9 years of his life just in that window. There's also time after he's converted we don't read about in Acts,
right?
Where he's off in the east effectively doing the same thing. And then after Acts, he will be released from prison. We don't ever read about that, but we can see that from other letters and we can see that from the historical record. He is released again, and he will continue to spend his life going from place to place and doing these things, right? And so we're just reading about this one little window of his life, but it is the whole of his life after his conversion. When he's not in prison, he's out spreading the gospel.
Yeah,
it's basically that.
And we don't know what exactly happened to Luke, why he didn't continue to chronicle all those things, because as we're going to find out here between now and Friday, the book kind of just ends.
Yeah, that he gets up there to Rome, and that's sort of the end of the story.
Yeah.
Which, tells us that's, as likely as we can say, that's when Luke is writing this, right?
Yep.
When he finishes, that's where they are. And he doesn't make another account after that. And maybe because he says, look, the record is done. My point was to say these are all the things that Jesus began to do and teach, and this is sort of the continuation of the things you built your faith upon. By the time you get to the end of Acts, you've kind of got that. Right, that work is done. It's not. It's not a biography of Paul, right? Luke, what happened? He's like, who cares? That's not the point of me writing, right? But
and sometimes this book is called the Acts of the Apostles.
Right. Yeah.
It really should be some of the acts of some of the
Some
apostles.
of the apostles, mainly Peter and Paul, right?
Peter, yeah. Mainly two guys,
Yeah.
for the most part,
And some of the other disciples as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's fine. So yeah, as we look at those things, you're right. Corinth is an interesting thing. It's sort of the setup of what's going to happen, and it's good because when you look at it's interesting because in Corinth, I mean, if you think about the Corinthian church, your first thought if you've read the Corinthian letters is, oh, look at all these problems they had, right? Yet their establishment is quite good, right? For a long time, a year and a half, he's there, he's strengthened him. He gets a vision saying, hey, no one's going to attack or harm you. I have many people in the city. I want to convert. All that goes on. And then it's after that, right? It's after that year and a half time that then the Jews of Corinth begin to make an attack on Paul and bring him to judgment. And that then sort of ends him and they leave town.
Yeah,
but up to that
Gallio
point,
being the
proconsul at that time.
Yeah, the proconsul, yep.
But up until that time, they have a good start. It's not like some of these other places where he shows up and it's like the first Sabbath, everything's good. And the next Sabbath, they run him out of town.
Right.
Right? Like he's here for a year and a half. And so that shed some interesting light on Corinth and those letters.
Well,
right?
it also gives a lot of reason or merit to how comfortable he was with just telling him how things really should be.
Yeah, right.
So you get to like a book like Colossians, for instance, letter to Colossians. Paul had never been there.
Right.
Paul only knew the church at Colossae by secondhand.
Right, from the message of their good works. Right, he's heard about them.
And so. Where Philippi, we see him also spending a lot of time in Philippi, and he's got great fondness for those people. He loves them intimately, he knows them well, and he expresses the same kind of love and devotion to the church in Corinth as well. But he also just happens to know that they were struggling when he needed to write them those letters, and so he had a lot more different things to say.
Yeah. As we kind of look down through this section here, then again, you could talk about every one of these things, but like you say, the end of the middle of 18, we'll sort of see the end of that, right? 18 down through about 22, he kind of is wrapping up. He leaves Corinth, he goes along Ephesus, then back, he gets to Antioch. Where Antioch is his home base where he's working out of. So 23, after spending time in Antioch, then he set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples, right? So he's in Antioch for a little while, then he leaves a little bit. We get this story about Apollos and Priscilla and Aquila going on. But then in 19, you kind of get Paul, right? So then Paul is moving through Ephesus, right? He finds some disciples there. And so now he's back on the road again, we sort of see. Remember, between the first and second, he's in Antioch for a while, and then they go down to Jerusalem because this question of circumcision has come up.
Right.
Right? We don't have any sort of interlude like that between the second and third. He's there for a while, then he hits the road again. Is kind of the whole of what did he do in between. He just took some time off to recharge and recoup and visit the brethren at his home church, so much as he had one, I guess, right, in Antioch, and then he's back on the road again.
So one of the questions is that comes up just in general Bible study and things, especially with new Christians, and just things that we should point out in general, knowledge we should have, or observations we should be able to make through the book of Acts, has a lot to do with the foundation of the church, how it operates, what do they do, and so we glean a lot of the things that come about what did they do, because they coming out of the old law and they had all the Jewish customs and things like that. And so what did the church look like then? We see in Acts where a lot of times they're meeting from house to house. They didn't necessarily have like an established church building.
Yeah.
The synagogues were there. Most of them were Jewish. It was coming out of fulfillment of the Jewish law, so it was natural to go to the synagogues, and so that was a place of worship as well as the temple in Jerusalem. But you also have this establishment of elders in these journeys, and so on the second missionary journey, one of their goals was to go back through and visit. It was the second, right?
Well, in the first one, they established them on their way back through.
Right. So the first one, they went and came back. That was the first one.
Yeah, and on the way back, they established elders in every city. And on the second one, it's let's go and visit the brethren and strengthen them and see how they do, right?
Exactly. And so we see this idea of church leadership being established and the need for church leadership, each congregation having its own elders. What we don't see is the establishment of any other organizational methods.
Right.
We don't see... The only thing we do see is that because the apostles who were appointed by Jesus, most of which happened to stay in Jerusalem, we see them being questioned when things came up so that everybody could be on the same page as to what the Spirit had to say about the topic, especially with circumcision and things like that. But there wasn't a head church. It wasn't the headquarters of things like that. There's no indication to say that they were over any other congregations, just that they had the Holy Spirit with them because of the appointment of them being apostles. They had authority given to them by Jesus. But Paul and Barnabas went through and they established elders at every congregation. Later on in some of Paul's other letters, specifically to Timothy and to Titus, as well as some of the things that Peter wrote about, we see, well, what is an elder? And Paul kind of defines that for us, and he gives us some guidelines to work with. And then we also see the church in Acts chapter 20, when they were gathering together. You had that crazy sermon that Paul did. They got together and they were spending time worshiping God all day together. And in fact, they were together for so long that Paul preached through the night, and that poor guy fell out of the window. And Paul raised him up from the dead there.
Yeah, and usually we'll say that Paul preached till midnight. Actually, he preached till dawn. He preached to midnight.
All the way through the night.
Yeah, the kid falls out the window and dies. Then they raise him from the dead, bring him back inside, and then he keeps on talking till daylight. Right?
Yeah. So if anybody complains about like the preacher going too long,
20 minutes long, that's not.
They got nothing on Paul, right? So.
But yeah, that's a story there. It's interesting because we see a very important idea there in Acts 20, right? As you sort of go there's all kinds of lessons and things, but there's certain things you don't want to miss, like you said. In Acts 20, as he's moving his way back down to Jerusalem, right? He knows he's going down there. He knows he's not going to see these Ephesian elders again. He knows he's going to go down there and get arrested. And so he calls them together in Acts chapter 20, these elders from Ephesus and the general region, and say, hey, come down and meet me here. And so when he gets down there, he brings these different elders of the church there in Ephesus. They come to him in Miletus, and he's telling them, hey, I'm going down. But he says this thing that's very interesting to them, right? 28, right? Right? So he's giving them this message that even in these early days of the church, right? At this point, again, we're now in the 50s, right? So it's been a little while. The church's been around for a couple of decades, but we're still in the early infancy of the church. He says there's going to be distortions of the truth. They're going to come in, they're going to distort the truth, and in so doing, they're going to draw away disciples after themselves. It's going to come from church leadership, right? It's going to come from among your own, right? A number of your own men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. And you don't have to wait very long. I mean, in the grand scheme of where we are historically and how long the church has been around, you don't have to wait very long for these distortions to start happening. I mean, we have writings from as early as the 200s where people are coming along and saying, hey, I don't think we should be baptizing infants, right? Which means by that point, they already are, right?
Right.
And by the 300s, you actually have the ideas coming out about, original sin, and we're all born, damned for hell, right? Kind of a thing. I mean, this is happening, and by the time you get into the 4s, 5s, 6s, you've got a full-on split and schism between the Eastern and Orthodoxy and the Western Orthodoxy and the Catholic Church. And
not necessarily that it was exactly what Paul was talking about, but you even see when in the writings to the church in Corinth, you had division happening there where they were taking, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and they're taking these sides and building these little sub-camps within the organization, within the church.
Yeah, and his whole letters are filled with, teaching against the Judaizers who were trying to preach circumcision being necessary, which had already been, which is funny because that had already been settled, right? That had already been settled, but they're still trying to get it around to that we should do this anyway. But we see these distortions even already being talked about in the New Testament letters, that these things are coming.
We see men like Diotrephes being called
loves
out.
to have the preeminence, right?
So,
we should not be surprised when we look at the history of the church, as we sometimes talk about church history, that you see these schisms and divisions and problems and distortions of the truth, because Paul said it's going to happen. With the Holy Spirit letting them know these things are going to happen, and I warned you about it, and I warned you about it with tears for 3 years. And now, what can I do except commit you to God and the word of His grace, which can build you up and give you an inheritance among all those who are sanctified? I now commit you to the grace of God and into the power of His word. That's what's going to keep you out of these problems.
Yep. Absolutely. That's a great point. Like it's so hard for us to put ourselves in their shoes and to know all that. And there's so many warnings like that throughout the scriptures for us to be on our guard, to constantly, when we talk about the Bereans, why were they more noble? Well, they were searching for the truth all the time. We can never let our guard down. We have to always be asking the right questions. Is this the truth? And can I verify it from the scriptures? And if we keep that at the forefront of our minds and make that a principle of how we live our lives and how we always look to God for the answers rather than for man for the answers. Proverbs 3:5, way back in Solomon, he wrote Proverbs 3, right? It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on what? Don't lean on your own understanding.
Right.
Because your understanding, man's understanding, will lead you astray, right? But in all your ways, acknowledge God and put him first. And so, the Bereans did that. The Hebrew author, as we talked about before, he cautioned about that. And time again, even Paul, when he was writing to Timothy, young preacher, he says, hey, you got to stick with it, you know? So we need to admonish ourselves, hey, brethren, stick with it, right? You got this. Put God first, get into the Word. Doing this podcast is not something I have to do, but it helps me.
Right. And if it helps someone else, great. Right, yeah.
And if it's also helping you, then praise the Lord, right? But it helps me to have this motivation to get into the Word and to do the work that's helping me to grow and helping me to keep on the right track. So, yeah, it's a good admonition. Yeah, so we had the third missionary journey where Paul is at Ephesus for 3 years, Macedonia, Corinth, Miletus, and Jerusalem, leading up into where he's in Jerusalem, and the Jews have finally had enough. You and I were talking about this earlier. It's kind of funny. We villainize the Roman government through history, rightfully so. They did a lot of horrible things to Christians.
Yeah.
But at the time of Jesus, as well as the time of Paul, they seem to be okay in terms of justice and truth. In terms of legal justice.
Legal justice,
truth.
right. Yeah. And so you'll see that happening here repeatedly as Paul faces opposition. We were kind of talking about, what's the theme of this week's readings? And it really is the growing opposition to Paul and his ministry. That's repeatedly what you're seeing happen throughout, right? Stirring up trouble. And we repeatedly see the Roman government sort of stepping in and saving him, bailing him out. Now, who's doing that? It's really God, right? But he's using the Roman government to say, hey, and we'll see it. They'll things like, in one case, they'll say, they're arguing about whether they say Jesus is dead and he says Jesus is alive. They're arguing about whether this guy's dead or alive. This has nothing to do with anything, right?
Right.
They're going to seize him at the end of 21, right? At the very end of chapter 21, he gets down to Jerusalem. He's there. And what you're going to see in verse 27, these 7 days were nearly over. He's in Jerusalem. Jews from the province of Asia, so not Jews from Jerusalem, Jews from the province of Asia who have been around these cities and stirring up problems for him wherever he goes. They stir up the whole crowd. They seize him, saying, hey, fellow Israelites, Jewish Jerusalem Jews, help us. This guy's going all over the world, spreading and bad things about us, right? And so the whole city is roused up. Verse 30, they come running from all directions. They seize him. They drag him from the temple. The gates are shut. And while they're trying to kill him, news reaches the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem's in an uproar. So he takes some officers down there, runs down the crowd, stops the beating of Paul, right? And says, we're going to have a trial. We're not just beating this guy in the square to death, right? Later, we're going to see a similar sort of situation. Oh, wait, are we arguing anymore? Before this, we saw a situation where, what is the city all in uproar about? What's it about? Oh, customs of this or that and the resurrection of dead. And it's just some Jewish dispute. Get it out of here, right? We're not beating a man to death or accusing a man to death over Jewish customs, right?
Yep.
No, go if you've got something legal to bring it to the courts. Otherwise, go home. And so, throughout this, we'll see, and even later, we're going to see there's a plot here to kill him, right? Some Jews come with a plot. The plot reaches the ears of Paul's nephew somehow. He brings it, and they say, take this guy to the Romans. And he says, look, they're going to kill this prisoner. And they say, not while he's on our charge. And so they kind of are continually, we're going to do this legally.
They secret him out of town,
Yeah, we're going to do this legally. Hey, bring him down here. No. You come You come up here and talk to us. We're not going to let you kill him on the road. Over and over again, the Roman government is protecting Paul. Now, part of that's because he's a citizen. And part of that is because the Roman policy, at this point anyway, is, listen, you can worship whatever gods you want. You can do whatever you want. Just keep the peace. And that will later change. When we get to Revelation, we see there's persecution happening on the hands of the Romans, and history tells us the same as well. And that will pretty much go on until Constantine, and then he'll say, enough of this. He becomes Christian, effectively, and that's what stops the persecution as the official government position. But for this period of time, the Romans are, like you said, they're interested in keeping the peace and making sure the legal laws are observed and that justice, as far as Roman justice is concerned, is carried out according to their laws. They're not just going to let a man get, like you said, butchered outside the temple in the middle of town, right?
Yeah. And I always get the names mixed up. It was Felix who was married to Bernice?
But the other way around. I got to look too because I always
Yeah.
which is which.
Festus?
You got Festus, you got Felix, you got a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
I have to think because you're right. I always mix up who's married to who as well. But yeah, you're going to get these trials. So yeah, when we get into 20 and 21, right from then on out, the narrative from here is effectively legal wranglings and maneuverings, plots to kill Paul, which are overthrown by the Roman government time and again, and Paul's repeated defenses. It's basically his trials, his accounts of his trials as you go. This is his trial before Felix, right? This is his trial just before the crowd, effectively, right?
Oh, it was King Agrippa whose wife was Bernice.
Bernice.
Right.
His trial before Festus, his trial before Agrippa, right? It's just trial after trial after trial before these different authority figures, legal authority figures. And so that's the rest of the story of Acts, effectively. And then he'll get his journey to Rome, as we sort of saw at the end of our reading today, that he's going to eventually appeal to Rome. And so he's going to get sent up to Rome for his trial and his appeal hearing there. But in those defenses, what's super interesting is he basically uses every opportunity of his defense to say, yeah, look, here's my defense. My defense is, I preach Jesus. Let me tell you about him, right? And then you can decide whether or not I should be killed for this. I don't think so, right? I'm just preaching a message, right? Like, it's just a religious thing, right? There's no legal reason to kill me. But over and over again, and here's the Jesus story, and here's the Jesus story.
Yeah. One of the things I didn't realize that the city and or region is called Caesarea Philippi.
Yeah.
Right, and the Philippian jailer. That story happens there in Philippi.
Philippi, yeah.
But he's imprisoned for at least a couple of years in Caesarea.
Yeah.
Was this where he was administered to by the church in Philippi?
Well, and so you see some of these things, right, where they're going to send relief to him, and some of those things, when he's writing these letters, he's writing them while he's imprisoned in Caesarea, right? And they're sending to his need again and again.
Yep.
And so yes, these things are when he's getting, not for certain, but yeah, it seems like these line up nicely, right? And we'll see later, we haven't read it yet, but when we get to the end of Rome, we get to the end and he's in Rome, he's able to stay in his own rented house.
Yeah.
Right, but he's under arrest.
House arrest, basically.
So how's he doing that, right? He's not out working. People are sending him and supporting him so he can have his own place to be there. And so you were seeing the other as he has already, which he'll mention in one of his defenses, right? I was gone for this period of time, then after this period of time I went down to Jerusalem and I showed up with just alms for the poor. I didn't start any chaos, I didn't start any problems. I was just there and delivered alms to the poor. We will then see the reverse of that people will then minister to him as well and take care of him in his need when he's in prison, when he's these things on the other side. Yeah, that was another one in the reading when I was listening to it one of these days. Instead of, we always call it Caesarea, right? And it was like Caesarea. We're like, well, yeah, it is Caesar, right? Caesar. It is Latin. It's Caesar, not Caesar.
Caesarea.
That makes sense. So, the pronunciations are always funny when you hear them, if you've heard them differently your whole life. But
yeah. Well, we tend to Americanize a lot of these things.
Oh, for sure. They've all been, anglicized afterwards as well. And it's funny when you see some of these things too. Some of just I don't know, right? Like Felix, right? So he's in
almost persuaded again, like one of those guys.
It's in here with Felix, right? It says Felix is well acquainted with the way, which means he's well acquainted with Christianity and what's going on, these disciples of this Jesus, right? He says, hey, when this guy comes down, I'll decide your case. And he says, hey, keep Paul here, right? Let his friends come and take care of his needs and give him some freedom or whatever, not just throwing him in the gulag, right? Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, right, who was Jewish. Oh, hey, let's...
Oh, that was what I was thinking of.
Yeah, let's come and listen to Paul, right? He's Jewish, and so he's, Felix is afraid. That's enough for now. You go ahead and leave, and I'll call for you when it's more convenient. Hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, right? So he sends him away, but he calls him in frequently to talk to him, hoping one day he's going to bribe him. So 2 years go by like this. He's in prison with Felix, right? And he comes and talks to him all the time, right? He's always reasoning to him about righteousness and these sorts of things. And then when Felix is succeeded, when he's done, when his term is over effectively, he could have let him go. But he's like, well, but because he wanted to do a favor to the Jews, he leaves Paul in prison, right?
Yeah.
I could have let him go. I know he's innocent, but I'm going to do a favor to the Jews. I'm going to leave it for the next guy. He's Festus's problem now, right? But, it leaves me in good standing with the Jews anyway. Then the new guy comes up. It basically starts all over again, right?
Yeah.
And now he's, what are you here
Why
for?
are you
Why
here
are you in my
for?
prison? Right. Well, you've been here for years. What are you here for? Well, let me tell you. Right? Here's what's going on, right? And so he makes his defense again, right? Festus does try and say, right? Hey, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem for trial? Because why are you here if this is a Jerusalem? Basically, it's a jurisdiction issue, right? Why are you in my prison? Let's go to Jerusalem and do this, right? The Jews would like it moved. Can we do that, right? And so that's when he says, yeah, no, I'm not going to go to Jerusalem because I know they're going to kill me on the way. I make my appeal to Caesar. If you don't want to try me in your court, then don't send me to a lesser court. Kick me up the chain, right? I appeal.
And then he's like, oh boy,
right.
Now what do I do?
Right. So then he says, I got to write something.
I'm going to send this prisoner to Caesar.
I need to have something to say why
he's
coming.
What do I write?
Right.
Because I don't know what the crime is here.
Yeah. So that's when he calls in Agrippa and Bernice, right? Yeah. And says, hey, because he just shows up, right? Because again, Festus is the new guy in charge. So they come up to, meet and greet, do the thing, right? State
with
visit.
Great pomp.
Yeah, great state visit there to pay their respects. And he goes, oh, hey, you know about Jewish stuff. I got this guy, right? Tell me you want to listen to this guy? Well, I need something to write when I send him up to Caesar. And so then we have another trial again, right? So it's just over and over and over the trials of Paul as he presents his case each time. But you get this idea, right, at the end where it is, each of these people in turn knows that Paul is not guilty. And so you had made a point, right, that there's a little bit of parallelism to Jesus here, right? He's in these trials. He's being falsely accused of things. The Jews are trying to kill him. Another thing that's similar is, the Roman authorities, Pilate knows he's not done anything wrong. And in the same things here, over and over again, we're like, this guy hasn't done anything wrong. But they just, kind of hang on to him because of political favors to the Jews or fear of what they're going to do. And then eventually Agrippa's like, oh, I would have told you to let this guy go, but since he's made his appeal, I guess send him up to Rome.
Our hands are tied now.
Our hands are tied. The legal process has started. But each of these people in turn knows this guy's not guilty of anything that's breaking Roman law. Let him go, right? Let him go. And eventually, we don't read about it in Acts, but the historical record and the letters that Paul will write let us know, if you read between the lines, that he does get released from this first Roman imprisonment, and he will be back out again, and then he'll get arrested again later. But yeah, so they eventually, I guess Caesar himself, or his court, goes, yeah, this guy's not guilty, let him go, right? And he's released, and he gets back out for a while after that as well. But,
all right, well, that basically wraps up this last week's reading.
Yeah.
I think Kevin and I were talking about the fact that we will be entering into the book of Romans, I believe, starting on Friday. So we will finish up the book of Acts here in the next few days, and we will probably just jump straight into the book of Romans on next week's reading. And because honestly, there's not a ton left to discuss in the book of Acts. It's mainly just Paul making it to Rome.
Yeah. And there's some good adventure stories along the way. Some good lessons we can learn.
There's a shipwreck, and he survives a snake bite, and it was more of the more preaching and more prophesying and all that kind of stuff, which is super entertaining and the adventures of Paul.
Yeah, getting to Rome.
And the acts of God working through him.
Yes, yeah. There's certainly good stuff. Don't skip the reading. But we're going to jump right into Romans, and we talk next week. Yeah.
Right, but Romans is a standalone kind of a meaty book, so we'll probably need to reserve our time to discuss more of the things that are happening in Romans. So with that said, God bless you all. Hope you enjoyed this last reading and going through the recap with us. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below wherever you are reading this or listening to it. We encourage. Thank you so much for everybody who also chimed in.
Comments.
Yeah, we really appreciate knowing that y'all are out there listening and giving us a thumbs up, and the encouragement has been very much welcome and appreciated. So that's it for now. Y'all have a great week, and go out there and let your light shine, and don't be afraid to persevere. So, all right, God bless. See you guys.